Our speaker today is Robin Hunicke from UC Santa Cruz and
Funomena.
Funomena. What? That's okay.
Get it?
Yeah. Okay. I'll think about that for a while. Why that was a problem for me. Okay. Robin was a graduate student at Northwestern, where she's ABD in computer science, specialized in artificial intelligence. She went from there to electronic arts, where she was the lead developer for something called My Sims, which you may have heard of. And after that, went to That Game Company, where she was the co-producer or producer?
Executive producer.
Executive producer for the game Journey. And I think I'm certain we're going to see Journey today in the talk. Today, after That Game Company, she went to UC Santa Cruz and founded Funomena, spelled F-U-N. That's why I had trouble pronouncing it. So she's quite busy these days, and we should be very grateful that she's come here to speak to us.
All right. So, as you heard, my name is Robin. I'm here to talk to you today about the concept of expanding games, which is something I think that is a really exciting topic. As you all know, games are available now in more places than ever. They're reaching new audiences via a lot of new devices, and that's a very exciting thing for us in games. There's new input and sensing technologies that you can use, like the leap motion, touch. There are even technologies that allow you to experience games in virtual spaces, in augmented spaces, blended realities. I've been doing a lot of work in this space lately. I recently just announced at Sundance that I'll be partnering with Oculus to develop some short interactions for their headset, which I'm very excited about. But the fact that there is new technology is not what's interesting about games to me. There's always new platforms, there's always something new. And if you look at the way we've talked about games in the past, the new is always the thing that we talk about with respect to technology, when in fact, what's compelling about games as a medium right now is that they're capable, because of these new input devices, of expressing a lot of different ideas, new ideas, new ways of communicating with people. Some of the images that you see here are from an iPad game called Luxuria Superbia that my friends Michael and Aryeh made. They're a couple. They live in Belgium. And they wanted to make a game that was focused on the idea of sensuality and spirituality, and specific, that was about their own relationship and the ways in which their marriage has ebbed and flowed. And they did a couple of concepts and ended up coming up with this iPad that won a bunch of awards last year, an iPad game. At the beginning of the process, Michael made one part of it, and Aryeh made a different part of it, and then those parts were brought together, much as two people fall in love or are brought together inside of a union. And I think that the idea behind the game is really interesting, the game itself is really interesting, and the fact that it was award-winning and got recognized, even when it is explicitly sensual in its sort of components, is really new. This is a new thing. 10 years ago, this would not have happened. And to see people like this making games like that, getting recognized, is really exciting to me. Games weren't always this way. And I think the way that we've thought about games in the past has very much been compartmentalized and sort of inside of a box that's about, you know, either that they're toy-like or that they enable sort of certain kinds of superhero fantasies, in particular male teen fantasies, and that they objectify or portray certain kinds of people in certain ways that may or may not necessarily be the way that we think of people now. So as a researcher and a maker and evangelist, I have always been thinking of games as an expressive medium, and I wanted to talk a bit today about how I got here and why I think it's important to consider them this way. So how did I start? I got into games the same way that everybody else did, by playing. You know, I enjoyed playing with things, and this is contemporary to my upbringing. I'm 41 years old, and when I was 7, I got a Lego kit like this for my birthday. My childhood was filled with opportunities to play outside and to be active in the wilderness. I was raised in upstate New York in Saratoga Springs, right near Skidmore, and I spent most of my time making forts and riding bikes and playing games outside, which is a privileged upbringing, especially in the cities and towns that we live in today. When it was too cold or rainy outside for us to go camping in our van, I would spend a lot of time inside drawing and building things. My dad and I made lots of stuff together. We made a grandfather's clock, put together with like an actual beautiful German clockworks that we built out of a kit. I made my own dollhouse, a lot of things like this, refinished furniture. Building and being creative were cultural ideas at the time when I was growing up in the 70s. My mom is a weaver, so I learned how to weave on a loom. I learned how to make baskets, how to make soap from animal fat, candles from animal fat. I mean, I did it all. I was a super hippie kid. But my parents were a teacher and an engineer, so it was always balanced with this idea that making things was important because it made the world a better place in some way, and not just because it was a creative outlet. Being curious and interdisciplinary, however, wasn't always encouraged in my schooling, and at times I struggled to choose between my love of the arts and making things and my love of science and engineering and making the world a better place. So by the time I graduated from high school, I had become the editor of my yearbook, the president of the art club. I'd been really interested in photography. I'd spent some time over in Cambridge at a summer school program where I first saw the works of William Blake. And I started to really feel that as an artist and a builder, I really wanted to blend both those things together. I felt that it was really important to try and find mediums where you could express technology and also feeling or emotion. I was really obsessed by the work of the Flemish masters for no particular reason. I was really interested in sculpture, in particular experimental sculpture like Lee Bontecu's work, who I think is just a total badass. I wanted to make art and write, but I also wanted to understand the world as a better place. And at the time that I was growing up, there was a lot of sort of overarching threat of nuclear war, which has come and gone over time. But I decided that I didn't have enough experience to make the kinds of works that moved me. This is the work of Anish Kapoor, who I also find really compelling as a sculptor. It's from an exhibit that he did at the Royal that I saw in, I think, 2009 when I was working on Journey. This is an air cannon that fires wax into the corner of the room, red wax, at 20-minute intervals. Very, very moving piece. You could hear it reverberate through the entire exhibit. So I ended up actually not being able to choose. I couldn't choose between art and science, and so I did an interdisciplinary studies BA at the University of Chicago. And I was supervised by Herman Sinenko and Wayne Booth, who is a critical theorist. He's passed on now, but a really interesting guy. And my work focused on art, women's studies, oral narrative, and computer science. I had sort of decided to look into computers because I didn't want to take one of the classes that was required for my math requirement. And I ended up taking a class called Computer Programming as a Liberal Art and started working on the Macintosh. I learned how to program first in HyperCard, then SuperCard, then Pascal, then I moved on to C, Lisp, and ended up just getting sucked into computer science and started thinking about doing a minor in math, which was what was available at the time because there was no computer science department at the U of C when I was studying. And I felt what was so interesting about computers at that time was that they could change the way that we thought about data and art, and that they could be that next medium for blending the things that I found so compelling about feeling and making things and also expressing innovative ideas. So as a researcher, I want to talk a little bit more about what that meant for me. When I graduated from my program, I graduated from my undergraduate program. It just took 3 years. And that BA that I talked about was loosely based on this idea of a circular poem by Octavio Paz. It was a supercard stack that as you read it, it changed over time. So the idea was that it was supposed to simulate my memories of being a gendered entity as a child. Memories that I had from my young life. When you got to the places in the story where I was older, if you went back and referenced them, if you clicked on them and re-remembered them, they would be remembered with a different filter. So for example, one of the stories in this narrative is about washing the car with my dad as a young child. And I remember being able to go out in the hot pavement in shorts and like wash the car with my dad and my brother, all of us wearing shorts and no shirt. And then at some point being told that it was inappropriate for me to attend the car washing ceremony in this particular outfit, that Robin would have to put on a bathing suit. Dad and Brian didn't have to put on a bathing suit. They could still go out in shorts and underpants and no shirt. But I had to put on this really uncomfortable, like Lycra outfit that with like a frilly butt and stuff. And it made no sense to me. Like as probably a 6-year-old kid, this idea just had no resonance with me because my understanding of myself was that I was the same as my brother and my dad. And when I go back and remember that as a 16-year-old, or I go back and remember it as a 21-year-old when I'm finishing this thesis, you can sort of reread that with more words, more understanding, more context, more nuance. I'm not going to say that this was the world's best written narrative, but it was definitely personal, and it definitely taught me a lot about trying to communicate ideas that change over time. That was the goal of the piece. After I started sort of thinking about what I wanted to do, having graduated very quickly from undergrad and having no plan, I ended up just kind of hanging out in the computer lab, and I started working with some professors there on robotics and AI stuff, and just got sucked into grad school, and I ended up just rolling into grad school. So I started working at first with a bunch of people that were from Yale that had studied with Roger Schenck, looking at knowledge representation and find me systems, kind of the early work that was being done in search before we'd really decided how we were going to search the web, before Google was the master. Eventually I got really interested in robotics, and specifically in trying to use the AI that I was building to tell stories, to get robots to be more like people, or more storytelling and less inhuman. At the time, there were a lot of people in academic AI circles that were saying that AI was the killer app for games, and that it could be used to make games seem more intelligent, to take away the robotic part of games, in particular to make them more interesting to play against. And so my thesis, which I began working on in I would say 2002-ish, was about dynamic difficulty for games, adjusting them to be more compelling to a user. In my research, what I did was I took a game called Half-Life, and I modified it. I used a mod called Case Closed. If you were bad at it, I made it easier for you to play. And if you were good at it, I made it harder for you to play. And then I ran a bunch of human subjects through, and I found that it had the opposite effect of what I wanted. If you were good at it and I made the game harder, it made you frustrated that you couldn't beat it because you were used to being an expert. And if you were bad at it and I made it easier, it just made it feel interminably long, because eventually you would die. It'd just take a lot longer. So the fundamental crux of my thesis, which is like 6 weeks away from being done, is that you can't fix a game design with AI. You can design good AI for a system from the beginning, but you cannot slap on intelligence to a system that's already been built. It doesn't work that way. If anything, I came to the conclusion that dynamic difficulty adjustment should be worked into a design from the beginning. And as I was coming to this conclusion, my contemporary, Genova Chen, who was a master's student at USC, was building his first game, Flow. It turned out later that we would end up working together. This belief that computers needed to be designed to be expressive in terms of their software from the ground up became the motivation for my switch, basically, from being a researcher to an evangelist in games itself. And I began scouring the internet for all kinds of books that would be about game design. You couldn't really study game design at the time that I wanted to study it, much like you couldn't really study computer science when I wanted to study it. So I feel like I've always just been like 2 or 3 years ahead of everybody else in a way that's like very uncomfortable. But I was really distracted by this idea that game design was the way that you could do intelligent AI, that games and AI were kind of the same thing. And I started harassing people, just like people that I met on the internet, and eventually ended up working on a curriculum for game design with the International Game Developers Association. And these are pictures from that time. There's me and Michael Matthias many, many years ago at a conference together, Eric Zimmerman, Jesper Juhl, my friend Isaac and Barut, who are now senior AI people in the games community. During this time, all of us were very interested in what we called narrative intelligence, which was a field that was just emerging, and the idea that computational systems could express new things and could be built from the ground up to express new things. And as it turned out, Michael and I would end up working together. He's basically spearheaded the development of the Center for Games and Playable Media at UC Santa Cruz, which now I am co-directing. So I also began teaching in this workshop at GDC. I've been teaching in it now for 14 years, where we teach a theory called MDA. It's a theory of design. And as I immersed myself in teaching this theory and hanging out with these people that were interested in computers as expressive media, I just got really, really excited about the idea of being in this community. And I edited a chapter on AI for game development. And then I started speaking, and I started talking about this framework, and it just revolutionized the way that I started approaching my own work. MDA stands for Mechanics, Dynamics, Aesthetics. The workshop sort of talks about how the mechanics are the rules of a system, the dynamics are the behavior of the system, and the aesthetics are the emotional outcome of the system. And I think you can apply that reasoning to an AI system, but you can also apply it to a game. And this is really where that bridge between AI and games just became so concrete for me. What's interesting and difficult about games and interactive systems, including interactive AI systems, is that the behavior of the system is only partially controlled by the inputs. It's just as much controlled by the outputs. And so the feeling and the style of expression that the computer has is very important. And one of the things I started thinking about a lot during this time is how do we manipulate the dynamics? Some designers start with the mechanics and move forward. So for example, in an AI system, you would say, I want the computer to be able to play chess. So I will program in the rules of chess. And eventually, I will have the aesthetic outcome of playing chess against the computer, which we've done, and we've done really well. It feels like playing chess against a computer, but it feels like playing chess against a computer. The other way to start is to start with the aesthetic outcome. I want to build a computer that is challenging to play chess against in the way that a human is. It's not necessarily the case that we've done that yet. We have built a computer that's better at solving for chess than people, but does it feel the same way to play against the computer as it does against a person? I'm not sure that it does. There's so many outputs that you get from a person when you're sitting across the table from them that you won't get from a machine. So this idea became the center of my research and eventually my commercial career, that you should find the feeling in the idea and work on that first, rather than trying to solve the problem just from a mechanical perspective, which is an engineering problem. Think about it from an artistic perspective as well. And I think it's actually the thing that's most difficult about building a system that's truly expressive or creates a sense of intelligence or feeling in another person. The other thing that I spent a lot of time doing during this time of my career was working on indie game jams. So we had heard about this thing called the demo scene, coders in Northern Europe building really cool applications with very, very, very small footprints. And we thought, what if we did something like that with games? And so a bunch of us, me and my random friends from the games industry, a lot of them from Looking Glass over in Boston and MIT, decided to just put together a weekend jam where we worked on a single engine and we all made weird games with that one engine. The first ever game jam, and now the game jams are pretty common. One of the things that we developed as a result of that was the experimental gameplay workshop, which is coming up here this year at GDC, the 13th year, where we show tons and tons and tons of random prototypes of experimental games. And so this is like in 2000, 2001, really pushing on the idea that in addition to focusing on the feeling, that the idea of rapidly experimenting and making small things to sort of explore the space of what computation could do in games was really important, and not just focusing on large commercial projects, which unfortunately take a ton of time and a ton of money. This session is 2 hours long. We usually show about 20 prototypes, and it's one of the most highly rated and well-attended sessions of GDC. Over almost 1,000 people come every year. I also began really thinking about curriculums. What is the way that we teach games? And I worked on a curriculum in animate arts at Northwestern with my advisor, Ian Horswell, based on the Bauhaus. The idea being that if you started thinking about computational media and building systems from the perspective of artistic practice, there would be a core set of foundational skills or materials that you should be able to work in. For example, programming being one of them, aesthetics being one of them, that would allow you to create objects longer term that were more holistic and more expressive than what you would do if you just thought about the mechanics and putting the rules in first. But I also started to wonder if moving into academia was really going to make me happy. The more I thought about this and the more I worked on it, the more I felt like there wasn't really a place for me to go. There weren't programs designed yet which I could teach in. The students weren't really there. And maybe, like when I thought about going to art school, maybe I should actually build some things first and get some knowledge before I started trying to teach people how to do it. So that's when I went to work for Will. I met him at an AI conference, and we were having a conversation about these ideas which were bubbling up in my mind in like 2005. And he said, you sound like a game designer. And I thought, that's crazy. Like, no one gets paid to do game design. Oh, wait a minute, you do. So I went to work on The Sims and then eventually got promoted to work on My Sims. Will was building Sport at the time. I didn't feel like I could really join that team. They were all too smart for me. But I really enjoyed my time on The Sims. It was probably the best job I've ever had. Because it taught me so much about how making games is a collaborative enterprise and how much it focuses on the idea of communication. I had been a graduate student for many, many, many years, and that meant that I was really good at reading books, going to talks, asking hard questions, and writing papers, and doing my own research. And I wasn't super great at collaborating with other people. I didn't really understand the values of collaboration as much as I could have, and being put into a very small team with a very tight timeline and having to rely on so many people to get something done really taught me a lot about both my strengths and weaknesses as an intellectual and as a maker. This was the first game I worked on, Open for Business, an expansion pack, and that's my second game. This was actually developed for the Wii, which at the time was called the Nintendo Revolution, which I really loved. This was like kind of Animal Crossing type game where you built things with blocks. So it was kind of like Animal Crossing meets Minecraft. I loved it. And working on it, while difficult, taught me that my real passion for development and building things came from the idea of sort of speaking an idea into the public and then making that a reality. And I loved the idea of collaborating with other people, especially because it meant that I could learn from them. And so in 2007, I was asked to go down to Los Angeles and work with Steven Spielberg, and I just jumped at the chance. We ended up working on this game called Boom Blocks, and it ended up, you know, sort of becoming an opportunity for me to learn some more and research and think about what I really wanted to achieve. Looking at how teams operated and specifically thinking about how to build a team that could collaborate with someone like Spielberg successfully over long distances. Sometimes he was on site and couldn't make it to meetings, and we would have to communicate with him over a VidCon. But a lot of times he would be on site and right there in the room, and he's a very, very smart person, and having him there, getting everybody to sort of see themselves as an equal stakeholder and a peer, it was a really awesome opportunity for me to think a lot about not just the hard part of building games, as in the computer part, but the soft part as well. And the controls of the Wii were very much an opportunity for me to think about how systems behave with new inputs. So even as I was sort of moving into commercial games, the research component of my life was still very open and really active, and I found it to be very compelling. But more than anything, it was a chance for me to think about what big games were becoming. So big computer games at EA, for example, were getting bigger and bigger. Teams were getting bigger and bigger. The Boom Blocks team was 36 people for the first, and then 16 for the second. The Medal of Honor team was close to 150 people. So we were the tiniest team in the building. The teams were very homogenous for the most part. Boom Blocks was not. We were very unique. We had a lot of different people from a lot of different places in the world. Not as many women as I would have liked, but we did have a female sound designer. But the rest of the teams were pretty non-diverse. And after being on The Sims, which was a 50-50 team, with people drawn from all over the world, I started to really feel like a little bit cramped inside the games industry. I felt like maybe I'd made the wrong choice. Maybe I should have stayed in academia, because there at least I'd be part of an international community, one that was truly global, and a little bit more open maybe to new ideas. So there was a growing sense in the company at large at EA at that time that games were becoming top heavy, and that we were sort of losing out to the business of games, that we were needing a way to get back towards what was the way we used to do things. So that this kind of idea had become this. And now we were sort of stuck in this really awkward place. And that we needed to go back there. That was kind of the feeling that we had. And it bothered me a lot. I'd only been in the industry for 3 years, and I was already kind of burning out. So we thought about trying to change at EA and make this blueprint label happen, and sort of focus on building small games. And my notebooks were filling up with ideas. I was really excited about the idea. I even taught a class at USC. I was really starting to sort of think about, maybe this is time for me to jump ship. And then we shipped our games, and I got asked by a friend of mine if I would consider coming to visit their team. And that was that game company. Genova, who was a colleague of mine in grad school, said that he had a new idea that he wanted to work on, and would I come down and take a look. And it was a really ambitious title, but it also sort of spoke to me about a lot of the things that I was interested in at the time. And the other game I was interviewing on at the time was Destiny. I was talking to Bungie about going there to do some design and production on that game, which I knew would be a really, really big, long title. And the idea of sort of taking a step back from the big games industry and going to a small company with just it was 5 people at the time. I'd be the 6th employee and the 6th owner of the company. I thought that would be pretty cool. So I did it. And then I moved back into the evangelism mode of like, okay, now I'm gonna start thinking about why did I do this, and I'm gonna try to speak this out to people. So everything I worked on at this time was connected to my feeling that had been building over the course of my career at EA, that the best way to build games is to start with the feeling first. And specifically that smaller teams made more sense when they were able to sort of have open communication about what that feeling should be. And I made a sort of a set of slides to communicate this at a small event that we had when Michael was first opening the Center for Games and Playable Media called Triple E Games. And so I did this presentation, these slides, before Journey was released, so before anyone knew what I was working on. I tried to describe what I wanted to be making, which was an elegant, expressive, and emotional game. What would that be like? So one definition of elegance that I think a lot of people are familiar with is this idea of being something that's high impact and low cost. So an elegant solution is one that makes the best and most strong impression, but takes the least effort. But I started thinking about it more in terms of ease of production and ease of use. That an elegant solution to, say, a game problem or an AI problem would be something that was very simple to get into. And the opposite of that would be Baroque. Something that was really hard to get into, like a really heavy MMO with a huge amount of UI. Expressive, to me, felt like the players would be able to speak and then the experience would respond. So again, looking at it from maybe an AI perspective and then a games perspective, you would be able to put stuff into the experience, but the experience would respond to you in a way that was really juicy and really elegant. And the opposite of that would be very scripted. So for example, Final Fantasy, which you grind through some systems and then you get a cutscene. Then you grind through some systems and you get a cutscene. That would be the opposite of what we were trying to build. And then the last was emotional. And I felt like this was really important, that it would have new feelings and it would be shaped by the feelings. So not only would it create new feelings in you, but your feelings about it would actually sort of color the interaction or the space of the interaction itself. And this just sounds really hand-wavy because you don't know what I'm talking about when you see these slides in particular at this time. The opposite of that to me would be rational. So something like a game of chess, where there really aren't that many feels. There's the rule set, and then there's the person across from you, and that's it. So this was the grid that I started talking about. Well, The Sims falls here. And you could say that a JRPG is somewhere around there. Something like Flower is a little bit more emotional and elegant than, say, Masters of Orion 3, which is really, really difficult. The AI was so complicated that it almost played itself. There's actually a grid on there, but you can't see it with this projector. There are games like Heavy Rain, which really push the boundary of emotional spaces. And games like Call of Duty Black Ops, let's say, that are a little bit more emotional but still pretty scripted overall. And then games like Spore, which I felt were expressive, but they were more towards the rational side than The Sims, more talking about kind of science stuff. So when I asked myself, what was at the ends of the spectrum specifically that we weren't looking at, what I really wanted to know for Journey was what was the most elegant and expressive and emotional game that we could make. What was a game that would allow you to have the most communicative relationship with the computer, that would be the most responsive to you, that your emotions about would color? What would that be like? And at the time, I had no idea that we would actually succeed. We were trying very hard. But my ultimate opinion at that time was that the ultimate result of a very expressive, elegant, emotional game would be that you would feel empathy towards the people that you were playing with. That this would be the outcome. And that games that improved the world would definitely have this component. Journey, I would say, it far exceeded our wildest expectations. We won Game of the Year in almost every game contest that year, beating out games that were tens of times as expensive with tens of times the staff. We won like online gameplay awards against games that were traditionally considered huge successes in that space. Journey is a non-violent game in which you walk across a desert towards a mountain and you occasionally run across another player. And that player is completely anonymous to you. The only actions that you can do with that player are sing to it or glide along the air with it as you glow. Because when you sing to each other or you come close to each other, you glow, and it makes the journey easier. It's extremely simple, very zen experience. It takes about 2 hours to play through. It was nominated for a Grammy. It's the first soundtrack for a game ever nominated against a film. So it did really, really well. But, you know, when we were working on it, the idea of building out that kind of experience was not without its problems. And that same kind of struggle that I had trying to sort of figure out what's the best way to build the soft part of the company kept cropping up. And I realized that there were some fundamental pieces missing from the team that I had built at TGC. I expanded the team from the 6 of us to 15 at its peak. In particular, I felt that there's a lot of work to be done in our industry to involve more women and more people of color and more international developers who brought fresh perspectives to the experience. At TGC, we never really got over about 16% women, 15%, sometimes 10%. It was rough. And I wanted to be able to build a company that changed that. And so I became a maker again. And I really believe that if you start with the aesthetic goal of a project and move backwards, that the mechanics will work themselves out. And that if you find the feeling in an idea, like I said, that it's very important to push on that feeling and make it happen. And so I decided to do something a little bit crazy and push on the idea of building company as hard as I had on the idea of building games. And that I would follow these tenets that I had followed throughout my career in actually trying to build an organization that accomplished not just the games themselves, but also the experience of working together that I wanted to have. And that this would be the secret sauce that actually made our games really successful. And I would just keep doing that until I was done. So I know that it's not easy to do this thing. Over time, when you're working on a project, you will go through lots of phases of doing this stuff. You will test and build and prototype and throw ideas away. And in a small team, you probably cycle through these things. Like on Journey, we went through it 3 times. 3 years, we built the game 3 different ways and finally shipped it. Sometimes you get stuck in a mode of execution. So you'll be, for example, ideating and then sort of prototyping and then throwing things away and testing within those blocks of time. And while there's no classic pattern of output, there is always a crux, which is that over time, the amount of effort that you put into something is hardest when it seems the most uncertain. And I know that starting a company would push me to new places of anxiety and unknowing, but I decided to go ahead and do it anyway. And so where I am now is that I run a feeling first company, which is drawn from my experiences as a graduate researcher, my experience as an individual contributor in a larger game company, my experience as an executive at a small game company, and my experience now as a teacher. That company is called Funomena. Do, 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 do. And I founded this company with Martin, who was my colleague at TGC. He was one of the senior engineers on Journey, and we worked together really closely. I've known him since I started there. He'd been there for the entire time the company was founded. And when we sat down to design our dream company, we thought about where we really wanted to go. What was the end point? We didn't want our company just to make the world a better place with its games. We wanted it to sort of improve the quality of life for people in the industry by setting a positive example about what games could be. And so we settled on the structure. There would be a big idea that we would work on, a large funded game, if we could find someone to fund one of our crazy ideas. At the same time, we would work on some smaller ideas, for example, the partnership that I'm doing with Oculus, and try to figure out ways of creating new technologies and new inputs for the games that we wanted to build. And then finally, we would give back. And so we would spend a significant portion of our time working on games that were for educational purposes, working on games that were for sort of helping society in some way or another, and that this would kind of filter up through the DNA of the company. And that the feeling of the company would be one of these sort of ideas. You know, it was just an idea at the time, but as we've iterated, it's actually turned into a real thing. So Funomena has now been incorporated for over 2 years. Next September will be our 3rd year anniversary if we make it. We wanted our company to feel a bit like camp, so that you would experience creativity, autonomy, mastery, and purpose every day as you work there. And the 20% time project that we decided to work on was actually the first thing that got funded for us. It's an NSF grant. It's a continuing project. We've been working on it now for about 2.5 years. It's called Terra. It's funded predominantly through their, the NSF's initiative for games and learning related to physical fitness. So the way that the game works is it takes data from a Fitbit, and kids basically use the Fitbit in class and as part of their lessons, and then they can use the steps that they've generated to play the game and terraform this lost planet and turn it into a hospitable environment for their people who have actually destroyed their own planet and need to move there. The next project, our big game that we have funded by Sony and was recently announced at PlayStation Experience, is designed by Keita Takahashi, who's a good friend of mine. He made a game called Katamari Damacy, which is my favorite game of all time. And this game is about this mayor and 2 deputies that live in a crazy, whimsical world of explosive fun. We haven't said very much about the game yet, so I'll leave it at that. And in the middle, between these 2 projects, is the 3rd idea that we're working on, which blends the ideas that we're exploring in both the non-for-profit game and in Keita's game, Watam, which are about the idea of childhood and learning and growing and how these things influence us as we're developing. So I'm going to show you what that game looks like. So this game is about an owl and a bird and the moon. And what happens in the game, that's the very beginning that you see, is that the bird wakes up with a feeling of unease in its belly. And when it's growing up and trying to make its own nest, it gets convinced by this owl that it will feel better if it swallows a piece of the moon. And that creates the beginning of a story. It's a fable that explains the journey of this bird and the moon and the owl in this sort of triangle that they are in. And the game itself is very much influenced by Mary Blair and Lee Bonteku and some of the other people that I mentioned earlier in the presentation. This is real-time rendered in Unity, so that's what it looks like. It's a very painterly and gorgeous looking game, and it'll be available for the PC and the tablet. And the idea for us is to be able to take these concepts of social and emotional learning, developmental challenges that turn into opportunities to become a better person and so forth, and put them into a game that people can play while sitting together on the couch and have a conversation about. It's been a very interesting project to work on. It's sponsored by Intel, and one of the things that we'll be supporting is their RealSense camera technology that allows you to gesture at the computer. So not only is it innovative in terms of the topics that it covers and the style of art that we're using. Glenn Hernandez, my art director, is amazing. And we're so lucky that we got him instead of Pixar. And it's also technologically innovative. And so it really does blend all those components And all the games that we're making at Funomena are that way. While the ideas are still relatively early in their development, what I have found is that the feeling of being collaborative, of being diverse, of giving back to the community, of trying to be truly empathetic and expressive within the company has actually generated these values inside the games themselves, and they feed back on each other. It still remains to be seen whether it'll be profitable. I mean, it's possible that we release these games and nobody likes them. It's possible that they get canceled midstream because, you know, Sony suffers from giant losses, or, you know, Intel suddenly decides that they don't want to ship the camera. These things could happen, but those things are beyond our control, so we'll assume that they won't. So what does it mean for you? Making feeling first games for me is now a way of life, but it comes from my understanding of how computers work, about people work, about how systems work, how knowledge gets shared. All of these things contributed to my journey into where I am now. And so as a maker and a researcher and an evangelist, I feel like there's no moment in your life that isn't relevant to what you're going to do in the future. It's important to think about all the things that create who you are as they're becoming who you are, and then to be able to integrate those into a narrative that makes sense. My life has not always been easy, and my path has not always been easy, but I do believe that there is no separation between research and living, between living and loving. I think all those things are related. I still feel like no matter what happens, you know, even when the path between A and B is really curvy, that every curve is valuable and every part of the journey should be valued and experienced. So no matter where you are, whether you're at the end of a long research career or at the beginning of a student career, you know, there are so many places that you can still go. I plan on doing a lot between now and 80. You could think of the passing of time as being something that's really scary, but I see it as a constant unfolding of possibility. If I had been able to participate or sort of anticipate that this much would have changed in the industry over time, I'm not sure I would have been as motivated to do all the weird things I did. But these are all conferences that started off before, you know, over the last 10 years, where the only thing that I really ever got to see when I did the Indie Game Jam was the Indie Game Jam. So, I mean, good things come from pushing. And in academia, it's been the same way. You know, programs in game design are now everywhere, and they're growing every year. And when I started looking at computer science and games, it was just a weird thing to even be thinking about. I think that the future is a really positive place, because if in 10 years that much can change, think about how much can change in the next 20. We don't really think about games this way anymore. I think we're moving away from this and towards something else. I think that the concept of what games can be and who makes games and why we make games is expanding in a way that's really valuable. We can think of them much more broadly now. We can think of them in terms of the empathy that they create, and think of them as an expressive medium, a medium that's waiting for us to shape it and iterate through it and turn it into new things for voices that have yet to be heard. I think that those voices are really powerful, and that games are one of the most powerful mediums capable of changing the world and making a real difference. And I think you should try it.